the bar. This session will be recorded. So, welcome to our last class in our Zero Net Carbon Design series, Regenerative Design in Practice. Today we have Michelle Sidney and Soham Patel from Imbalanced Green Consulting, who will be teaching our course today. Before I hand it off to them, I just have a few 3C Run slides to go through. My name's Itel Torres, and yeah, I'm with the 3C Run team. So a little bit about 3C Run. We are a collaborative partnership between Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo, and Ventura County. We work on providing energy efficiency in our region and providing free programs to provide services to building professionals and households. And 3C Run is funded by ratepayer money, so which are collected through the public good charge fund and the utility bills. And currently we have 3 programs. Next slide. Oops. The first one being our Energy Code Connect program, where we offer industry trainings, regional forums, and Title 24 consultation services called Energy Code Coach to help building professionals navigate the California Energy Code and green building requirements. Our next one, we have our building performance training program, which we offer trainings on technical and soft skills related to building science principles and systems for high performance building. And last, our home energy savings program, which serves households that are historically underserved with free and discounted home energy upgrades. And without further ado, I'll hand it off to Soham and Michelle to get us started today.
Hi there, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Soham Patel. I'm here with Imbalanced Green Consulting. With me today is Michelle Zimney, also here with Imbalanced Green Consulting. And today is our last of our 5-part series in Zero Net Carbon Design, where we'll be talking about regenerative design. Just to make sure you all know, you will be receiving these slides after this presentation today. We also have time saved at the end for questions, but if it's something urgent, feel free to drop it in the chat. We'll have people monitoring the chat throughout the conversation, and maybe we'll answer it then, but if not, we'll definitely have time at the end. And finally, just do check to make sure you are unmuted throughout the presentation. You should have been unmuted when you entered, but always safe to check. In this presentation, because it's our last one, we're going to start off with a quick summary of all the Zero Net Carbon Design strategies we've talked about over our 5-part series. And then we're going to introduce this continuum of moving from sustainable towards this new term regenerative design. We're going to talk about how we can embody that type of thinking in the way we plan transportation in our communities and the role design plays in that, as well as how we think about the communities that we design within. And finally, finishing off with a case study of regenerative thinking in action. So, based on the last 4 presentations, we've talked about a lot of building-centric approaches to reducing carbon, either both operational and embodied. Beginning with operational, we've talked about ways to make higher performing buildings and possibly reaching a net zero point through operational carbon emissions. In our first ZNCD presentation, we talked about where we get our energy from and procuring it from a clean grid. Here we see this image of the duck curve, where we learn that as we electrify, our demand is shifting from the middle of the day towards the evening when we're all returning home. Because of this, hopefully we're seeing solar panels like the ones in this project more common on our buildings, but that alongside that, we're adding batteries to our projects to acknowledge the shift, because solar power is often more available in the middle of the day. With batteries, we can store that energy to the evening when there is peak demand, as well as build resilient projects that can store this energy in the case of power failure. Additionally, we looked at how much energy buildings use, seeing that 35% of energy here on the West Coast is consumed by residential and commercial buildings. And of that 35%, that over 50% is dedicated to space conditioning, water heating, and air conditioning, or space heating, water heating, and air conditioning. To address that, we talked about the benefits and of heat pump for heating, cooling, and water heating, and how to acknowledge that in your design. And then we looked more closely at the story of water and the impact of how far and where we get our water from plays on energy use. We talked about it through this case study of Hotel ZNC, where we compared a couple of different scenarios, starting with a California baseline, then looking at low flow and low flush fixtures, and finally reusing water through rainwater or wastewater treatment processes, seeing that we can have almost a 50% savings in the water that we use. Then, in ZNCD4, we went over the strategies for reducing that second part of the chart of embodied carbon, reminding ourselves that this could be done through a variety of ways, such as in building design, making early decisions in the process that can have an impact in reduction of embodied carbon, as well as ways to find environmentally preferred products through a 1-to-1 swap and where sort of those hotspots are of embodied carbon. And finally, how we can specify and procure our materials in a certain way as to help with their environmental impact. So in this course, we've talked about ways to lower both our operational and our embodied carbon emissions as it comes from the building industry. But while we were going through these moves, we've also moved up in scale, starting at first with the building, then maybe looking at our watershed, to then the places that we get all of our materials from when talking about embodied carbon. This kind of moving up in scale can be a lot to grasp. And so that's why we want to introduce to you today regenerative design as a way to understand and think about all of the places and peoples involved with design.
So can I have the next slide, Soham?
Sorry.
Thanks. All right, so when we're talking about sustainable versus regenerative, what exactly are we talking about here? You may be familiar with this graphic where green building and sustainable building and design sort of is aimed at mitigating the negative impacts of design and construction industry, and working through rating systems like LEED or CalGreen or other systems looking at the different impact categories and reducing those impacts, we can maybe arrive at a net zero design. Where regenerative comes into play is looking to promote positive social and environmental impacts and actually leaving a building site and neighborhood better off than before the construction project. Specifically, when we're talking about regenerative, we're looking at a definition that describes processes that support, replenish, and respect the sources of their energy and resources. And so the regenerative design is a process-oriented, necessarily, process-oriented approach to design that's in pursuit of planetary and community health. No small thing. To help understand this, we can think about this, a building as a system, right? And we've seen this graphic before, where there are processes, there are material, energy, and water inputs, as well as material, water, and energy waste or outputs. And so if we're comparing sustainable and regenerative approaches to this system, in a sustainable way of thinking, we might acknowledge that the source of all these resources is limited and thus try to minimize the amount that we consume and the waste that we produce. Versus in a regenerative approach, we consider how the resources we use might be maximized for their utility. So such as recycling materials or treating water to, in essence, sort of create resources through reuse. We're generating more uses out of the resources that are limited in our environment. Another way to look at it is to sort of take it by sector, where sustainable water might be using strategies that minimize water use so that less water is going into the sewage system. Regenerative water approaches would minimize water use and promote reusing it in the building or disposing of it in a local water shed for recharge so that it's not just a waste product. Sustainable energy might use strategies that minimize energy consumption and shift toward all electric projects that use renewable energy resources. A regenerative energy project would focus on generating and storing renewable energy for resilience and sort of maximizing the utility of the renewable resources. energy resources. Sustainable materials would focus on low manufacturing impact, so that cradle to gate scope that we talked about in the embodied carbon webinar, and recycling and diverting materials from landfills. Regenerative approach to materials would look at a wider scope, so maybe a cradle to cradle impact where there's demolition and reuse of materials and recycling of waste. And so with this sort of systematic approach, we consider how the resources we can use, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're good.
Yeah.
And so having gone over with the potential for regenerative design here, we want to look at all the ways we can incorporate this type of thinking, not in just to our buildings, as you see now in the graphic, to larger communities. And so one of these sectors that we haven't quite talked about in terms of carbon emissions is transportation. As we can think about it, transportation is the way that we connect buildings to each other simply through roads, but also how people navigate their communities. And as we can see, transportation makes up 40% of total global carbon emissions. And so today we're going to talk about how we can look at and embody regenerative thinking. We're talking about transportation or the design for access in our buildings. So one of the simplest ways, and sort of the low-hanging fruit that's already out there, is through our EV charging and EV parking requirements. And so Cal Green already incorporates this. Hopefully you're comfortable with these requirements already. But we should acknowledge that a car, whether it's gas-powered, electric, or even autonomous, is still a car, and that the infrastructure in the vehicle itself has an associated space use associated with it. And so in this study done in the UK, they did this comparison of the city center of Siena, Italy, a historic town in central Italy, to this famous interchange in Houston, which is the interchange between 3 different major interstates. And what they found is that they take up comparable surface area, but one houses 30,000 people, the other doesn't house any, or maybe unfortunately does house some unhoused people. And so what this should hopefully make us ask is, if we didn't dedicate all this space to automobile infrastructure, what could we use that space for that benefits communities? In one scenario on the left, this is a lively paseo with plenty of community services. And on the right, this is an interchange to have to navigate through. And so we should consider alternative ways of moving throughout our communities, with buses and bikes being more efficient and taking up less space. There's also a very clear carbon trade-off with these choices as well. In this study done by Lufthansa, they examined the amount of carbon emissions per kilometer per passenger travel in different modes of transit. So a car, very high associated emissions, because there's maybe only 4, maybe 6 people in a car in the distance it travels. Hybrid's better. But then we see that buses, subways, and electric buses have a lower impact, given that they move more people over less space, and that bikes come in pretty low, given their associated embodied carbon, and obviously walking has no associated emissions. It should be acknowledged, though, that as designers, we maybe don't pass transportation measures or decide where roads get built. But if the general direction is of moving towards a more environmentally friendly means of transportation, it is our role as designers to choice to travel by means other than car. And often in places, that choice is by bike. I used to live in the city of Los Angeles, and I chose to bike to work. I didn't live that far. And these here are some pictures of bike racks that I had to park my bike at very well-known architecture firms. You know, they're not very dignified, not very secure, kind of suspicious places to park your bike. And so while this kind of feels like low-hanging fruit, a bike rack is a way to affirm the choice to move not by car. You know, we can stick with a pretty bland gray bike rack that meets the bare minimum Cal Green requirement, or we can consider bike racks as part of the design process to make it desirable to commute by bike. On the right here, we see the logo for NATCO, which is the National Association of Transportation Consultants and Organizers. And they're a community, they're a group that's working to help architects and designers design better bike racks and forms of transportation that are not just cars. And so if you're interested in maybe elevating your bike rack game, I would reach out to this organization and check out their resources of design guidelines for bikes. We also want to acknowledge that regenerative thinking expands the scope to communities. It's interested in the community scale just because it doesn't only require something with relationship between buildings, but also buildings to people in the area, as well as the local ecosystem. Particularly, it's interested in making sure that all of these environmental benefits that we're producing with our buildings are equitably accessed by everyone. That as we add more net zero or sustainable buildings, that all communities can benefit from these choices. And oftentimes, this disconnect between who benefits from our green building choices is unfortunately in the design process. If you're a firm that's designing a single family home, you often have the benefit of the main client being the end user. And so you get to communicate with them very freely about their desires. But if you work on other kinds of projects, often civic projects, there's usually some middle person who might not always have the best interests in mind. This here, I want to take a moment and call in a community that I think has been doing really great work to help engage communities, the Detroit Design Collaborative. They worked with the AIA to produce this guide on a project they call the Avis and Ellesmere project that walked through ways that architecture firms can incorporate community involvement as deliverables as part of the project, sort of helping make it clear in traditional project delivery how that happens. And so this project in particular was a renovation of a 2,400 square foot building. The city had identified it as a project to become some sort of civic space, and they hired an architect at Al Collaborative, but the architect was having a really hard time figuring out what exactly should go into this community to actually help the people in the area, given that they were always working with the city. So Detroit Collaborative Design Center came in, and they worked with the architects to help reconsider who a stakeholder is. This neighborhood is mainly residential with working parents. And so a lot of children are going to school, being taken care of by their grandparents, and are often just looking for things to do in the neighborhood. So there's a lot of children who are skateboarding, graffitiing on a blank wall when they can find it, a lot of older people who maybe can't travel that far for their basic needs, as well as just general families. And so working through the Detroit Collaborative Design Center and their sort of process, they were able to come up with a more finely tuned program where they had a community center, as was asked for by the city. But given that there were all these children who were already engaging in artistic activities, but maybe not directed in the right place, they then opened an arts center, as well as a food co-op to help with the older residents who couldn't commute that far to a grocery store, to make sure that they were not in a food desert. And now I'm going to pass it on to Michelle to help us talk about the benefit of biophilic design when it comes to regenerative design. You're unmuted, Michelle.
Thanks, Soham. So some of you may be familiar with biophilia as a concept or biophilic design, but I thought I'd go through briefly a description of what we're talking about here. The generally acknowledged founder of biophilia principles is E.O. Wilson, and here's a nice quote where and he defined biophilia as the innate tendency to focus on life and lifelike processes among humans, but we're finding more and more among other animals as well. And he noted that our existence depends on this propensity, our spirit is woven from it, and our hope rises on its currents. Biophilic design uses this sort of approach to humans in our natural world. Can you click? Oh. Uses this biophilia applied to the design and development of the human-built environment. And we'll go through some examples and some categorization of how to approach a biophilic design process. So there are a lot of ways to kind of parse it out. In general, people divide biophilic design measures into three categories. First, we'll take a look at a direct experience of nature. So this is sort of the plants in the corner approach to biophilic design, but it's much broader than that. Direct experience of nature might include light and air and water, and yes, plants or animals, landscapes, weather, views, even sort of inclusion of limited fire elements in a building. And here we see the Changi Airport in Singapore, which is biophilic design on steroids, right? Obviously, we've got the light and the plants in the water, but it's interesting to note that among this category, we see weather as sort of a direct experience of nature that we might seek out. And here you could see with this glass ceiling, you would know when a storm passes, right? This access to the water is very, very dramatic. And I recommend anybody go take a look at it if you're passing through Singapore anytime soon. Let's take a look at a second category. Oh, I'm sorry. Another example of this on a much smaller scale, right, is this school in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, where designers found a different way to bring water and weather and access to that process into the classroom via an in-floor channel. So when it rains outside, water flows through this sort of rock bed under a transparent panel in the concrete floor. And you can see that students delight in this. This is a learning exercise and opportunity, and it's also beautiful. So the second category that is often used to help organize sort of biophilic design principles is instead of direct experience of nature, indirect the experience of nature. So this is where we see, images, patterns, textures, colors, geometries that evoke nature. In this patio, you see a cut metal panel in geometric form, right? As well as steel planters that will patina with time. And so that sort of is an analog to natural processes or natural patterns. On the right-hand side, you can see a project near a watershed, for instance, where there may be tule reeds or cattails, could bring that natural analog indoors. And here it's in a clean environment where there are plexiglass panels that have this patterning on them, and kind of trigger a connection to that external ecology. As well as if you were near a water body, you might sort of mirror that patterning in a rammed earth wall, or maybe even a tile pattern that has waves in it. And so ways to sort of connect the indoors and the outdoors through colored pattern and texture. A third broad category. Is it not working? Broadens the scope beyond sort of individual materials to think about the space and the experience of a place. So the context, the cultural or the ecological context of a project. And here you'll see that this is a transitional space in an office building. And it affords occupants sort of a dynamic sense of prospect and refuge. So this is a key concept for biophilic design, where human need for security is triggered by these safe spaces where you can look out across a savanna historically, and have that dynamic sort of space where you can see what's coming. There's also organized complexity here. So you see random light patterns sort of bouncing off more orderly rectilinear building forms. And so different pieces or parts come together as a whole that make this an entry space that is award-winning. It has variation, but also is very clear wayfinding. And it's a very effective sort of biophilic design space on a scale. So that's just a little bit sort of an introduction. So what good is biophilic design for us? I mean, really, is it measurable? Are there benefits that we can talk about specifically for going to all the trouble of bringing this approach to your project? So here I'm drawing on a summary table of studies. Fortunately for us, the research into the benefits of biophilic design is pretty robust, and it's continuing to develop. In this chart, which I borrowed from Terrapin Bright Green, there are 14 patterns of biophilic design. We can see that there's 3 broad categories of benefits that are measured in their research. So first off, there's the first column is sort of stress reduction, and you can see a wide variety of studies that have measured improvements in stress reduction using different biophilic design principles. Secondly, there's been a focus on sort of taking a look at cognitive performance improvements, and again, widely distributed across the different biophilic design measures. And then thirdly, sort of emotional mood preference improvements, especially in healthcare. We'll see shortly in a slide coming up. But again, the distribution of studies showing a connection between measures in the 3 different categories and this sort of outcome it's a very strong connection. So, and I say we've got these other categories as well. So then across the table, you can see these are all measures of having nature in your space, right? And it affects all three sort of categories. The natural analogs are broadly represented, as is the nature of the space when you're paying attention to those prospect and refuge. Here, mystery, risk, and peril all have an effect. So those are studies that broadly just sort of address all space types. Terrapin Bright Green has done a service as well, breaking it out by sector, and we see really specific outcomes that are targeted with measures, for instance, in the education sector. So here you can see that stress and well-being are, similarly impacted by biophilic design measures, but they've also looked at cognitive function and test performance improvements. So in that third column, you can see that measures with indoor plants, views to nature, general greenness of a building actually have measurable improvements, impacts on cognitive performance and test performance for students. Similarly, in the healthcare environment, healthcare specific studies show that things like patient length of stay is reduced with views to nature and daylight. And in patient experience, whether it's a reduction in pain or stress or overall satisfaction with a hospital stay is improved with these same elements, plus use of natural materials, natural sounds, and even this is really interesting, even simulated prospect and refuge views have measurable impact on patient experience. And then the third category that I want to highlight here, because we are talking about regenerative communities, is community impacts of incorporating these sort of design moves. Specifically here, it's a really interesting scope of work. They summarize studies on community and impact categories such as public health, crime and aggression reduction, community cohesion, pro-social behavior, and then even real estate value and tourism. And at the scale of community, design elements such as a common green space, urban greenery, and a sense of nature connectedness all contribute to improved community health across these measures. This aligns with research that is informing an emerging biophilic cities movement. There's an organization called the Biophilic Cities Initiative, which links urban nature, such as trees, parks, green rooftops, and views of nature for urban inhabitants with positive impacts on health, social connections, and city infrastructure. And I think we need some let's see, next slide, please. Whoops. So here we can see some examples, right? So local green spaces contain trees and plants that draw down carbon. So what's the link between sort of this urban nature biophilic design at community scale and zero carbon, right? Local green spaces contain trees and plants that draw down carbon, reducing energy use. Green and rainwater collecting rooftops provide views to nature from within buildings. They can have insulative qualities and even produce food. So this reduces energy and water use. Urban natural spaces provide social and recreational opportunities with a really low carbon footprint. And then even green infrastructure reduces stormwater runoff, which results in lower energy and water waste used for cleaning and pumping water. A fun fact, more than half of the rain that falls on urban areas because of the impervious space ends up as runoff. And so when we can produce sites that help recharge and infiltrate stormwater, it's sort of a win-win. And here you see, if you're not familiar with these projects, this is the High Line to Rail project in New York City, where they've created green spaces, access to sort of cooling stations and water, exercise and social gathering spaces. The large hotel project there is the Park Royal Hotel in Singapore, where they were able to include vertical plantings that replaced 215% of the site area. So the footprint of the building is over double that in plantings once the project is done, and giving residents and occupants views to nature virtually from every window. And here we have an edible wall, but we have more and more edible rooftops in urban environments. Oh, sorry, I got ahead of you. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Soham.
Awesome. Thanks, Michelle. So now to sort of show you that the proof is in the pudding and that this can be all wrapped up into a building project, we're going to talk here about a case study that is an architecture firm office of ArcNexus located in Sacramento that recently just received the Living Building Challenge Award. And so this project was previously a warehouse that was transformed into an office for this firm. It's around 8,200 square feet, and it's the first Living Building Challenge certified building in California. Living Building Challenge, if you're not familiar, LBC, operates in a structure similar to LEED. LEED has 6 categories. Living Building Challenge has 7 petals. As you can see, there's somewhat of a correlation between like place and sustainable sites. For example, materials in LBC, materials and resources in LEED. But the difference here is that Living Building Challenge adds in these petals about beauty and equity, where equity talks about supporting a just and equitable world, and beauty talks about uplifting the human spirit, their words. And so the ArcNexus Building Reuse Project, when this firm was looking to build a new project, they decided to exclusively look at adaptive reuse sites. And so this here is what the building looked like before they came in and built it out. And in this process, they decided to set up a preference for materials. So salvage was preferred over wood, over steel, and have this pecking order or hierarchy of what materials they would want to keep and reuse in the project. This project has an EUI of 26, which is half the typical office building in Sacramento, produces all of its energy and more through a PV system or photovoltaic solar system. And it was very intentional in the way it designed its windows to optimize the daylight for their open floor office plan. And one of the things they talked about to help with their energy use was taking advantage of this thing called the Prius effect. And the Prius effect refers to this idea that if you show people how much energy they're using at any given time, it'll then affect their behavior and encourage them to use less energy. That constant feedback loop helps with energy use reduction. And so, as mentioned, their systems for energy, they had ample access to daylight, minimizing the amount of indoor lighting that needed to be used, a very large PV array, as well as that Prius effect that I mentioned. When it came to water, they installed these very large rainwater storage tanks that you can see here in the picture on the left. The building's water needs are fully met by rainwater. They have no flow urinals and composting toilets. And they even put in the work so that all wastewater is treated on site, so that water doesn't have to be sent to the municipal sewer system, and that they're 100% net positive water. In terms of materials, when they were working on demoing the project, the wall sheathing from the existing mansard, which is the name for that roof shape, it was reused because it was in the condition that it could be, and was reused as exterior wall sheathing. And when they were removing the existing bat insulation, they did so in a way so that they could reinstall it in the parapet walls, so that at a later point, if the project decided to expand or needed to add some exterior walls, there was already insulation on site stored in a way that it wouldn't be damaged in those parapet walls. And the final example of the ones we have here is that lava rock mulch that was on the existing project, when it could, was saved and then reused in their planter boxes that go into their urban farm that Michelle will talk about in a second. In regards to transportation, the site had existing bike racks for the employees that were found on the site and brought in more that the contractor took from another site that wasn't planning on keeping it, so recycling the use of bike racks. But they also went a little bit further, and the office located in red at that map there is at the end of this public development project for R Street, called the R Street Streetscape Redevelopment Project, where they're trying to encourage pedestrians and bikers to feel more comfortable on the street. And so they actively participated in this process and said, like, we want it to be bike friendly, and was part of the community feedback to help make sure not only that they had bike racks, but the employees could access the building safely if they chose to bike or walk. And then in terms of biophilic design principles, what we see here is they really leaned into urban agriculture. So this idea that, sorry, Michelle, this is yours. But
Sure, you want to hand it off? Yeah.
Yeah.
So the biophilic design aspects of this project are really interesting and beautiful, right? So they've got urban agriculture in the form of planters. They also have a lot of native plantings. And because the site is almost a zero lot line, they included in their project garden space offsite at a near public school in order to sort of satisfy part of the living building challenge requirement for food production and bringing in a community benefit from their specific office construction project. You can see that they also have nature inside in the form of this plant, live plant green wall in the main office space. There's abundant daylight and views. And in that office space, you can also see that they have sun tubes that are specifically placed to light the groupings of workstations with daylight because it is a pretty deep interior space. And so they really thoughtfully approached daylighting as a zero electric lights during the day kind of requirement. The lobby area, actually, if you see where the PVs are in the corner there, I love this. They have PVs on the roof abundantly, right? And you'll notice that the lobby is actually at a slightly different orientation. And so that's this space here with the blue chairs, where they wanted to maximize sort of the view to the exterior across the intersection. And they like to call, what did they call this? They wanted the community to be able to see architects in their native environment from the sidewalk, which is in a meeting room, essentially. I love the material selection on the outside of that lobby area and then through that wall as well, where they have Cortan steel that is patina aging with time. And that addresses sort of that natural analogs element of biophilic design. It also speaks to sort of a cultural historical moment in this part of the Sacramento downtown, where the railroad was a prominent feature. And so they've kind of evoked that steel rails element of the history of the city in their building material selection. And that's to foster sort of a connection to space, to the place with native plants and that reorienting of the lobby. So those are some biophilic design elements. They've got a ton more with their selection of native plantings and some other shapes and features on the inside that we couldn't fit pictures here. But as a living building challenge project, they really addressed a broad variety of biophilic design elements, as well as the mainstay sort of green building categories that we have been talking about in this zero carbon design webinar in the form of water and energy and materials.
Thank you, Michelle. And with it being a living building challenge certified project, there's plenty of information about it online. So if you're interested, you can also look it up on their website as well as the LBC website. And so this brings us to the conclusion of our regenerative design presentation here. And what we want to acknowledge is that, well, some of the stuff we might have said here before maybe is new to you, maybe it isn't, maybe it feels really far off. But just a reminder that as our cultural values change about what is sustainable and what is green, we've been able to adapt to that very easily. On the left here, we see falling water. At the time, it was applauded and still is for its connection to nature and the experience, those biophilic elements of the water running through the project and the views out to nature. But now, as we're getting more and more concerned about our carbon emissions, we've been finding ways to bring it in tighter. Here on the right here, we see the Van Dusen Botanical Gardens in Vancouver, Canada, that recycles all of its water through these green roofs, has it from their skylights on the top, and both very beautiful projects, but showing that we've built green before and that we're able to continue to build green, adapting to these cultural values. So while regenerative design might seem far off, we've been building green, we'll continue to build green, and hopefully we'll start to see more projects like the one on the right that are sensible, or that are sensitive to the environmental systems that they sit within.
You can move to the next slide for Itzel.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Soham and Michelle, for a super informative training. Just a little closing slide for 3CRN. Um, I'm dropping my email on the chat if you have any questions regarding AIA learning units. I will be sending out the certificates to everyone that has completed the 5 hours or how many hours you have by the end of the week. So look out for those. You should be getting slides and the survey and the recording of this presentation in your email later this week as well, and a little bit more about our trainings that we have coming up. I will drop the link to our calendar as well if you're interested in registering for any of that. Well, and thank you so much. I think that's it for me, and I'll hand it back to Michelle and Soham to answer any questions.
Thanks, Itzel. I'm noting that we've got ample time for questions, and I'm not seeing a whole lot in the chat, and that's fine. Yeah, there's a lot to look at here, and so maybe it's enough to just sort of have had a lot of ideas sort of presented in front of you. But if folks have questions, we do have time to sort of field those and start a conversation. If people wanted to have it be more of a dialogue back and forth, that we're happy to do that as well. Sharing resources, ideas, and questions. So go ahead and use the chat to communicate with us. If you wanted to, we can read your question, or you can also ask it live if you like. We'll just give folks a few minutes. You're welcome, Allen Construction. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I think we must have said everything perfectly clearly with all knowing information.
Right, no follow-ups. They got everything on the first try.
I'm going to drop my email in as well. If folks, get off the webinar and then have questions later in terms of a slide reference or a resource, you can feel free to contact me. We do have a question. Are there LBC certifications out there? Yes, there are. So is the question, are there buildings that have been certified, or is it a question about what are the different levels of certification? If it's the latter, okay, there we go. So this is, we didn't include this slide, but happy to include it here. There you go. So Living Building Challenge is a certification standard that is created and monitored or certified by the International Living Future Institute, ILFI, and where they started with sort of lead as a sustainable kind of approach to construction. They wanted to bump everything into, well, what if every building active construction left the site better than you started? And so they started with this Living Building Challenge full certification that you see on the right hand side with 20 imperatives, and you had to do all of them. That is still the case. But as they sort of fielded projects and understood that, different jurisdictions and climates have limitations, they have sort of figured out other ways to approach the overall goals of regenerative net positive building with these other sort of brands of certifications. So they have a pedal certification that focuses on really the core central imperatives. And you'll see here net positive water, net positive energy, and a real focus on materials, not only for the toxicity of materials in construction projects, but also for the toxic impacts on communities that are located where materials are manufactured. So you see these cancer zones and whatnots. And so they've really focused that pedal certification on getting material sort of cleaned up in the construction industry. They have a core certification now, which is geared to be roughly LEED Platinum, with a different approach, a more holistic approach to certification, not points so much, but fulfillment of imperatives wholesale. And they also have zero energy and zero carbon certifications. We have several projects that are pursuing zero energy and zero carbon on the South Coast in the Tri-County 3C REN region. And so it's definitely something that's happening. Living building challenge buildings are fewer and farther between, but we're hoping to bring some of these core and pedal certified projects into our region in the near future. Great question. It's something that's not as familiar with folks. Oh, there you go. Now you page through it.
My bad. I didn't realize that you had animated it also.
I always animate. And are there any other questions? I'm seeing thank yous. I appreciate all of you being here. Any other questions folks have? Well, maybe with that, I'm not seeing any questions coming in. Thanks, that was great. We're so happy that you were able to join us today, and I will bring the presentation to a close, thanking 3C REN for providing a platform for the Zero Net Carbon design series, and a big thank you also from Imbalance Green Consulting and all the staff here who has made these presentations. We've had a great audience, and I've loved being able to work with you all. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.